So what does it mean that Ezra transitioned us to Judaism of rabbis? In what ways is a Judaism of rabbis different than a Judaism of prophets? So again, Ramban said that even though we don't have prophecy of visions, visionaries, people aren't seeing visions of God anymore, but the Chachamim, they have a different type of nevuah, a different type of connection with God through their intellect. They use their mind to learn and analyze halacha, and God sort of supports them in that, so they know the truth by the divine spirit within, right? In other words, through their analysis and Hashem's guidance, they reach an understanding of Judaism. Similarly, Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, he takes this a step further. He points out that by making this transition, that now the intellect, the analysis, the wisdom is part of how we understand Judaism. This enables it to keep going from one generation to the next. We do have this notion that every generation feels like they're further away from Har Sinai, and so they're not as great as the generations before. But nevertheless, says Tzadok Kohen, once these lights are made available to every generation by the great ones among the sages of Israel, right? And once in every generation we have the Chachamim that are wise and have knowledge, they remain open forever. The gates of wisdom are always open. Why? Because even though later generations are inferior to earlier ones, this is the key line, they nevertheless maintain their awareness of knowledge as dwarfs on the shoulders of giants. Right? When it comes to wisdom and understanding, there are things I understand that maybe Rashi didn't understand, not because I'm smarter than him, because I have the benefit of living after him, and so I can read his writings and read the writings of other great Meforshim who lived after him and scrutinized what he said and agreed or disagreed with what he said, and I have all their knowledge at my fingertips on my computer to look up, so I'm like a dwarf who's sitting on the shoulders of these great giants, people like Rashi and Ramban and Ibn Ezra and Rambam, and with prophets, it was harder to do that. If you were a Navi, either God spoke to you or he didn't speak to you. What good does it do you as a Navi that generations earlier there was some other Navi? Right? You're kind of out there on your own between you and God, trying to get God to speak to you. But once we switch to a Judaism of rabbis, which is sort of knowledge-based and intellect-based, right? As Ramban said, our intellect knows truth by the divine spirit within. So then that means a Judaism in which in every generation, even if we feel like, people of certain previous generations seem like greater Chachamim, who do we have today who's as brilliant as Rambam or Rashi or Ramban? But even so, every Torah scholar today has the ability to read the writings of Rashi and Rambam and Ramban. And therefore, we can continue to develop Judaism, continue to have trust in the wisdom of our religious leaders today, because even if they might seem like dwarfs when they're measured against some of the great leaders of previous generations, they can build upon the wisdom of those generations and therefore be dwarfs who are sitting on the shoulders of giants. Right? A dwarf who's sitting on the shoulder of a giant is actually taller than the giant because he's sitting on the giant's shoulders. He can see further than the giant can because he's higher up. So even though he himself is a dwarf, he benefits from the giant's height and can see further with it and look taller because of the shoulders that he's on. And so, in this way, the transition that Ezra makes to a Judaism of rabbis is a transition that makes it possible for Judaism to keep on going from one generation to the next, even without direct communication of God. Because in every generation, we can read and study all the wisdom that came before us, and based on that, we can receive guidance for how we should live. And if you think about it, Ezra is the first person to really do this, right? Look back in Nehemiah Perek Chet, Nehemiah Perek Tet. What does Ezra keep doing? He keeps reading from the Torah, right? He gathers them to repent. They have to fast and confess their sins. Like Sefer Torah Hashem Elokehem. And Ezra reads to them from the Torah. In the previous chapter, in Perek Chet, talking about Rosh Hashanah, similarly, we were told on Rosh Hashanah, Ezra gathered them, he brought the Torah before them, and he reads it to them, and the Leviim explain it to them. And so, part of what I mean when I say Ezra is the first rabbi, he's the first one where he's not saying to them, like Yirmiyahu would say, Ko Amar Hashem, Hashem told me something. Instead, Ezra says, I'm not here to tell you what Hashem told me. I'm here to take out the Torah We're going to read what it says in the Torah and explain what it says in the Torah, and that's how you're going to know how you're supposed to act. That's how you know, first of all, you have to do tshuva for your intermarriage. That's how you're then going to know later in this parak about the importance of Sukkot, because they're going to find where it's written in the Torah, where it's katuv b'Torah, that Hashem commanded to dwell in Sukkot for 7 days. So this is a new model. Ezra doesn't give prophecy. Ezra doesn't stand up and say, Hashem told me X. Instead, Ezra has them learn with him from what it says in the Torah. And this is the new model of what we call Rabbinic Judaism, in which we don't trust our Rabbanim because we think that God spoke with them. We trust them that they're educating us in what God's Torah says. And so this is a major paradigm shift, a major shift in the model of Judaism that Ezra accomplished. Now, looking back, since this is the end of what we're learning together in terms of Navi, it's important to reflect on what we've seen in these last couple of generations that we studied. Right? First, Korah said they could come back. Then there were some delays, but 19 years later, they finally started building the Beit HaMikdash under Darius. And then 60 years after that, a couple generations after that, Ezra comes back with the support of Artaxerxes. And it's clear from these gaps, right? The 19 years here, and the gap from building the Beit HaMikdash until Ezra, where it seems like the spiritual level of the people is very low because they're so assimilated when Ezra comes. It seems like the transition back to Eretz Yisrael, back to a Beit HaMikdash, isn't nearly as smooth as people had hoped. And the question is, why not? After all, it sounded so promising, right? If you look back to Ezra chapter 1, remember when you read Ezra chapter 1, it really seemed like everything was going to be great. Remember that chapter? Let's scroll back a bit to get that far back. Remember when Koresh became king and right away he issued this proclamation, Kol mamlachot haaretz natan li Hashem elokei hashamayim. Hashem gave me my entire empire. He commanded me to build a temple in Jerusalem. Whoever wants to from his people, may his God be with him. He should go to Yerushalayim. He should build a temple for Hashem, the God in Yerushalayim. From all that great promise where it seemed like that's it, the people are going to be redeemed. We're going to go back to being Am Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael, just like it used to be before the exile, and things are going to be great again. What made it turn out to not be so smooth, to have all these bumps in the road that, for 19 years they couldn't get the temple built, and then for another 60 years they have the temple, but they're assimilated. And this whole time, they don't have sovereignty. They don't have their own Jewish king in Israel. All they have is autonomy, some sort of independence with a governor like Zerubbabel or Nehemiah, under Persian kings like Koresh and Daryavesh and Artaxerxes. Why did it turn out this way? So I assigned to you to read this article by Rabbi Chaim Angel. Let's look in our booklet here. And if we look in our booklet, we see in Rabbi Angel's article where he talks about the transition to Ezra as the first rabbi. I have to rotate this for you to read it properly. So he points out that Chazal mentioned a couple of different sins. In the various midrashim, let's find the one over here. Here we go. Excuse me, I'm one page off. All right, here we go. In the Gemara, it tells us as follows, that Bnei Israel didn't return as fast as they were supposed to. Let's find a couple of sources here. Here we go. Had you made yourselves like a wall and had all of you come up in the days of Ezra, right? If all the Jews had returned to Jerusalem for the Second Temple period, then it would have been something which never rots, like silver. But instead, what happened? Because you came up like a bunch of doors, because they came up in smaller groups. Doors here is a mashal. A door as opposed to a wall is much flimsier, right? you came up like a door and not like a wall. You came to Israel in these small groups, a few with Zerubbabel, a few with Ezra, but not a huge mass aliyah. Therefore, your temple is something that can rot like wood. In other words, the Beit HaMikdash, the second Beit HaMikdash, is not going to be permanent. And so the Gemara there seems to be saying, and there's another Gemara earlier that he doesn't quote it over here exactly. Here we go. Excuse me. I'm not finding this quoted. Excuse me, this is a quote from the Gemara Brachot. Gemara Brachot says, the intention was to perform a miracle for all of Israel in the days of Ezra. God wanted to perform a miracle for everyone, to redeem everyone, just like he did in the days of Yehoshua ben Nun. Remember, in Yehoshua's time, God helps them conquer all of Eretz Israel and rule over all of Eretz Israel. So the Gemara says God wanted to do that for Ezra also, right? That here in the Second Temple period, they should conquer everything, rule over all of Eretz Israel. But sin caused the miracle to be withheld. Because they sinned, God didn't do that. So again, what sin was it? We saw a second ago in this first passage that about the wall and the door. That's a complicated way of basically saying that most Jews stayed in Babylonia. Most Jews couldn't be bothered to come to Eretz Israel, so God said, okay, if they're not coming to Eretz Israel, then I'm not going to fully redeem the Jews who do come. So the Jews who come to Yerushalayim, they get this limited autonomy, a little bit of self-government, and they have the Beit HaMikdash, but everything happens slowly. It's not quite as great as the first temple. It's not quite as permanent. And the Zohar mentions a different concern, which is intermarriage. This is quoted as well in the article by Rabbi Angel that I gave you to read. The Zohar says over here, scroll down a little bit on the same page, when they left Babylonia, they became defiled there and desecrated the temple by marrying foreign wives, meaning non-Jewish wives. Israel was worthy of having overt miracles performed for them when they left Babylonia. They were worthy, or in theory it should have been that when they left Bavel to come back to Israel, God would start performing miracles for them, just like when we left Egypt. But the sin of the foreign wives prevented that from happening. This sin of intermarriage prevented God from feeling comfortable doing miracles and fully redeeming them. And so these two major sins, that most of the Jews who were in Bavel stayed there, and that the Jews who came back to Jerusalem intermarried and assimilated, for those two reasons, Hashem decided he's not going to fully redeem them. And so yes, they got the Beit HaMikdash, yes, they got some autonomy, but it was not like, let's say, in Shlomo's time, where they had a Beit HaMikdash and their own king who ruled over Eretz Israel. And so we very much leave this period of the Second Temple with it being sort of a mixed bag. On the one hand, it's great to have the Beit HaMikdash back, and it's great that there are some Jews living in Yerushalayim with their own Jewish governor in Yerushalayim. But on the other hand, it's disappointing that these Jews do not have their own king, their own independence, their own sovereignty in Eretz Israel. And the truth is, they don't really deserve that, because it's sad that most Jews still live in Chutz La'aretz. I'm sorry that I couldn't be with you in class today myself. I hope these videos were helpful, and I look forward to being with you on Thursday for one last review before the final.